Well, hope you guys had a great Christmas. Delighted to have you here with us this morning. Today, we've been in Advent for the last 4 weeks, and we put our series on John on pause, and today we're picking it back up. It might have been obvious based on the passage that Bob just read to you. We're going to be here in the first passage. It's kind of like three kind of what we call pericopes, 3 sections of John 5. And we're going to be here in this first one, sort of. I need to just kind of warn you a little bit. Around Christmas time, we are somewhat of a skeleton crew. And so I was required to give my exact passage to read and the title of the sermon 2 or 3 weeks ago. And that was before I had studied or written or done a word. And so then what I ended up doing is a little bit different. So the focus we're going to have this morning is actually not the part that Bob read. So Bob did exactly what I asked him to do 2 weeks ago before I actually figured out what I wanted to do. So we're going to be in John 5, but it's going to be a little bit different, right? This is the passage. We'll begin here, at least, in this story here of Jesus healing a man who is an invalid. He's been lying near a pool for 38 years, which is a long time, without any improvement. And then when Jesus shows up, in a moment, he is instantly healed. It's a miracle. And what I was initially going to do was take a look at this miracle. But if you recall, in John's gospel, miracles aren't just miracles, right? They're not just demonstrations of compassion. They're not just proof of power. In John's gospel, what's a miracle? What do we call them? That's right. We call them signs. We call them signs because they signify something. And so as I was working through this over the last couple of weeks, I just thought I'd rather talk about what it signifies, the message that it's carrying, than the actual event of what he does. So what I want you to kind of lean in with me is, what does this one mean? Why did he do it? What are we supposed to take from this? And as near as I can tell, John is doing 3 things. This sign is meant to signify 3 different messages. And I think it would be helpful if we grasped all 3 of them. But honestly, I'm just going to hit the first 2 really quickly because I want to save my time for the third one, all right? Here's the sign itself. Let me just give this to you again. Verse 2 says, "Now there is in Jerusalem by the sheep gate a pool, in Aramaic called Bethesda, which has 5 roofed colonnades. In these lay a multitude of invalids, blind, lame, paralyzed. One man was there who had been an invalid for 38 years. And when Jesus saw him lying there, and he knew that he'd already been there a long time, he said to him, 'Do you want to be healed?' The sick man answered him, 'Sir, I have no one to put me into the pool when the water is stirred up, and while I'm going, another steps down before me.' Jesus said to him, 'Get up, take up your bed, and walk.' And at once the man was healed, and he took up his bed and walked." Okay? Now, the first signy thing about this sign is not obvious unless we take a bigger bite of context, which we just didn't have time to have Bob read. You would need to look not just at verses 1 to 15 or even verses 1 to 18, but you need to move into the second third of John 5 to really see what it is that John is setting up. Because one of the things that he's doing here in this first portion is he's giving us a template for what he's about to say in this second portion, okay? The second portion, Jesus is going to make a really important comment about the power of his own voice, all right? So in verse 8, in our passage this morning, Jesus says, "Get up." That's all. That's the function of the miracle. And immediately this guy just obeys. He just gets up, right? For 38 years, he wasn't able to walk. But then suddenly, he was able to walk simply because Jesus told him to. Get up. And suddenly he was able to get up, okay? Now, if you script down outside of our passage down to verse 25, you're going to see that eventually Jesus is going to say, "Truly, truly, I say to you, an hour is coming and is now here when the dead will hear the voice of the Son of God, and those who hear it will live." And then again, he'll say in verse 28, "Do not marvel at this, for an hour is coming when all who are in their tombs will hear his voice and come out. Those who have done good to the resurrection of life, and those who have done evil to the resurrection of judgment." So one of the things that John is doing here in our passage is he's basically foreshadowing that the day is coming when Jesus' words will raise the dead. Healing an invalid is infinitely beyond my power, right? I could tell you to get up all day long. It would do nothing, right? But for Jesus, saying get up and walk to an invalid is literally nothing compared to the fact that one day he will say to every person who has ever lived or died, get up. And we all will, right? What John is doing is he's setting us up. He's preparing us to see the unbelievable power of Jesus' voice, okay? That's one of the signs. Here's the second thing. John is building tension about this swirling controversy. This kind of permeates the entire gospel. This is a very important thing that John is trying to do. Who is this guy? Who is this guy? And what he's showing is that throughout Jesus' ministry, people were constantly murmuring, like, what is the deal with this guy? Like, what can explain it? Who is he, right? We're going to see this really build throughout John's gospel. Who could say the things that he says? Who could do the things that he does? And this is a subtext to his identity is, who does he think he is? Jesus' self-conception, which happens to be the same as his actual identity, is a huge controversy, right? There's all this curiosity, there's all this consternation, really, about the identity of Jesus. And in the next several chapters of John, which for us will be the next several months of John, it's just going to build. It's going to reach its climax, really at a fevered pitch in chapter 9. I can't wait till we get there. But here in chapter 5, they're going to ask in verse 12, who was it that healed you? And then in verse 15, they want to know, well, what gave him the right to do that? And then in verse 18, they get really mad because Jesus' response betrays that he thinks he himself is equal with God, all right? So for now, all I want you to notice is that Jesus' identity and Jesus' self-conception are a huge issue for John. And every chance he gets, he's going to be like, do you see this? The conversations that are happening. And I'll just say by way of application, that conversation that begins in Jesus' years of ministry, it's never stopped for the last 2,000 years. And his faithful followers, we like to stir up that same controversy. Wouldn't it be amazing if at your place of work, in your neighborhood, among your family, there was just this question, who is this guy? Like, honestly, like, what is the best explanation for all that we've seen about him? All right, so John is deeply interested in that. But here's where we're going to spend our time. And we have 23 minutes left. That's just good news. All right, here's the third thing that I want to talk about. There's these different signs, this sign signifies different things, is maybe a better way to say it. It means something. There's something he's going here. In chapter 5 is where John introduces one of the massive controversies that just pervaded Jesus' entire ministry. And I'm curious if you recognize what it is. It would be helpful, perhaps, to remember that John's gospel, sometimes it's just called the fourth gospel. And we don't mean by that it was merely written or that it's like recorded. You know, you go through Matthew, then Mark, then Luke, then you finally get to John. It's not just that it's like the fourth one in the order of your printed Bible, but rather it was the fourth one that was actually written. Matthew and Mark and Luke were done before John's gospel started. John wrote late in the game. He wrote, not only were they written, but they were read. They'd been received by the church. And John knew what they said. Not only did John live there, he lived through the things recorded in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, but he'd read the books. He would have known this kind of corpus of data that existed in the church about Jesus. And he wrote John's gospel largely to supplement it. He knew what people knew, but he also knew what he knew, and he knew a lot of the story was missing. Matthew, Mark, and Luke are very similar to one another. There's a lot of overlapping data. We call them the synoptics because they look the same. They're written from the same vantage point. And John comes out of the woods with like totally new content, just entirely different stuff. And he's done that on purpose because he knows he knows you know these stories. He knows you've heard these parables. But this is the stuff, this is kind of the rest of the story, so to speak. And so when he's writing, everything he says, you got to understand that he knew Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And he knew that in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, there was a theme that had developed. As the other three gospel writers described the story of Jesus' life and his ministry, they wrote frequently about a recurring conflict that Jesus had with the Jewish leaders. I want to give you a list of the times this comes up in the synoptics, okay? Number 1, Jesus and his friends ate grain that they had picked in a grain field. They'd kind of draw the grain off the stalk and they'd rub it in their hands and kind of make this thick little kind of semi-bread pod, and then to get the husks off, and then they'd eat it, right? Number 2, Jesus healed a man who had a withered hand, and he did so in a particularly conspicuous way. They had grown suspicious, and so they were watching him, and they were trying to see what he was going to do and if he would do anything in secret. And rather than do something in secret, he just calls the guy up to the stage, to the front of the room. And he invites him up there and then says, stretch out your hand. And he does it in front of everyone. And this guy's hand that's been withered and crippled is suddenly healed and whole. Number 3, he once healed a woman who had been bent over for 18 years. She's just like walking, sometimes you'll see some, I don't even know what happens, but she lives like this for 18 years. And Jesus says, straighten up. And he heals her. 4th thing, Jesus healed a man who had dropsy. Dropsy is a kind of edema where fluid gathers in your limbs. So maybe he had just one massive leg or a significant persistent swelling in his arm, and Jesus healed him. And all of those actions, each one of them just an inconsequential snack, right? And the rest of them, acts of kindness and mercy, drew enormous scrutiny, frustration, and anger. They literally drove the Jews to plot Jesus' murder. So the question is, what do they all have in common? What was going on with all of those events? They all took place on a Saturday. That's right. All of these miracles, these acts of kindness, and this snack all took place on the Sabbath, the holy day for the Jews. And they thought that Jesus was breaking the Sabbath, and they hated him for it. It was a massive controversy, and it just dogged Jesus all of his days. I say it dogged him, and that may make it sound as if he was trying to avoid it. But the reality is, you guys, Jesus repeatedly and flagrantly flaunted disregard for the current Jewish understanding of Sabbath keeping. He wasn't just getting caught unawares, He was doing it on purpose. And John was aware of this. He had read Matthew, Mark, and Luke's accounts. He knew that this just shows up over and over again. He lived through it. He remembers the things that Jesus would do on a Saturday and the response that it earned. And so what he's about to do here in John 5 is jump in himself. He's like, oh yeah, you heard about this one and this one and this one and this one, but those weren't the only times. And so he just starts to dogpile. He's going to add, he doesn't do, not only in chapter 5, but in chapter 5 it comes up, chapter 7 it comes up, chapter 9 it comes up, and John is just going to keep throwing fuel on the fire about Jesus' distinct and intentional acts to run afoul of the Jewish perception of the Sabbath. Right? It's the first time he does it, but he's going to keep doing it. We'll see this repeatedly over the next couple of months. All right. Notice here, and this is where I didn't have Bob read all of this. Notice how much the Sabbath concerns just pervade this whole sign. We'll start in the middle of verse 9. It says, "Now that day was the Sabbath. So the Jews said to the man who had been healed, 'It is the Sabbath, and it's not lawful for you to take up your bed.' But he answered them, 'The man who healed me, that man said to me, take up your bed and walk.' They asked him, 'Well, who is this man who said to you, take up your bed and walk?' Now the man who had been healed didn't know who it was, for Jesus had withdrawn, as there was a crowd in that place. And afterward, Jesus found him in the temple and said to him, 'See, you're well. Sin no more, that nothing worse may happen to you.' In verse 15, the man went away and told the Jews that it was Jesus who had healed him. And this was why the Jews were persecuting Jesus, because he was doing these things on the Sabbath. But Jesus answered him, 'My Father is working until now, and I am working.' And this is why the Jews were seeking all the more to kill him, because not only was he breaking the Sabbath, but he was even calling God his own Father, making himself equal with God." Okay? So Matthew and Mark and Luke and John give a huge amount of time to Jesus' relationship to the Sabbath. And I'm not sure that we generally understand all that Jesus was doing there. So I really want to use this as an opportunity to kind of give you a little bit of theology about both Old Testament and New Testament theology on the Sabbath. But it won't take too long. It'll probably take no more than 15 minutes and 52 seconds, Lord willing. Okay. But I want you to see this. This is the signiest sign of this sign. This is what is chiefly going on. Yes, it is about the power of Jesus' voice to raise the dead. Yes, it is about the nature of his identity, but it is chiefly what's going on here in this story is Jesus is once again challenging the prevailing understanding, the teaching about the Sabbath, and bringing his own very challenging teaching about it. Okay? So this is the part I really want you to understand. First thing you got to get your head around here, if we're going to be fair about this, is why was Sabbath keeping such a big deal to the Jews? Do you know why? It's because it was a big deal to God. It shows up over and over in the Old Testament with very, very strong language, okay? They're not making this up, all right? Take a listen to this. We'll just give you one. There's several we could have looked at, but for the sake of time, Exodus 31, verses 12 to 14. This is not the Jews' misinterpretation of it. This is God's own word. He says this, "And the Lord said to Moses, you are to speak to the people of Israel and say, above all," that's strong, "above all, you shall keep my Sabbaths. For this is a sign between me and you throughout your generations, that you may know that I, the Lord, sanctify you. You shall keep the Sabbath, because it is holy for you. Everyone who profanes it shall be put to death." Okay? That's strong, right? It's going to say it again. "Whoever does any work on it, that soul shall be cut off from among his people." That cut off is a euphemism. Twice now. They have to die. Verse 15, "6 days shall the work be done, but the seventh day is a Sabbath of solemn rest, holy to the Lord. Whoever does any work on the Sabbath day shall be put to death." That's 3 times now. Verse 16, "Therefore the people of Israel shall keep the Sabbath, observing the Sabbath throughout the generations as a covenant forever. It is a sign forever between me and the people of Israel, that in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, and on the seventh day he rested and was refreshed." Okay? So in defense of the Jewish leaders, they are not making this up. And they're not exaggerating. This was a huge thing. And if we had the time to walk through some other passages, this is not unique in the Old Testament to speak about the Sabbath with such strength and such vigor, with such persistence. It just shows up all over the place, okay? I'm curious for you guys. I wish we had time to really unpack this, but think about your childhoods, okay? What was your experience of Sabbath keeping as a kid? Were any of you not allowed to play on Sundays? Was that for any of you? Or do you guys remember growing up? What are you know what blue laws are? Okay, what's a blue law? You can't buy alcohol. You can't go to the store. You can't go to Lowe's. What other day do you want to go to Lowe's if not on a Sunday, right? So all of these things. Okay, did any of you grow up? Were you even aware as a child that Sunday isn't actually the Sabbath? The Sabbath is Saturday. And Sunday, which was probably framed to you as the Sabbath, is actually something else entirely. Did you know that when you were kids? Did you know that 30 seconds ago, right? Right? So we have lots and lots. Oh, have you ever been driving on a highway with your family on a Sunday and you want to stop and get something to eat and you see the sign that says Chick-fil-A? And then you realize it's Sunday. Right? Okay. We have lots of cultural expressions of this, at least in the United States we do, of Sabbath keeping. And they're not all, honestly, necessarily biblical per se, but they are probably related to Bible. And then some of you maybe grew up with a complete disregard of the Sabbath. It's like 7 days in a week. Let's get something done here, right? So you're probably coming at it from a lot of different perspectives. Whatever your perspective was, the time that Jesus is living, when the Jews come after Jesus, they had good biblical basis to think this day, Saturday, not Sunday, was incredibly important and one ought not violate the Sabbath. And so when Jesus interacts with them, he does not just shrug them off. He doesn't just be like, it's nothing, move on. Rather, he uses every time they get angry with him as an opportunity to teach a lesson about the Sabbath. Because though they were not wrong that it's a big deal, they were not wrong that God cares deeply about it, they were wrong about what it meant. They had a misunderstanding. And so Jesus tends to use their anger and kind of slingshot around it to teach them something new about the Sabbath. And I'm not sure that all of his teachings have really filtered down to us. So we're going to walk through and show you some of these things. I want you to see why he did what he did each time he kind of interferes with their Sabbath. He is trying to change their incorrect and their incomplete understanding of the Sabbath. And so each time he goes, they come after him, he gives them a different lesson. When he straightens up the woman who is bent over, he applied basic compassion. He says, listen, if you untie your ox on your donkey to lead it to water, why can I not untie this woman whom Satan has kept bound for 18 years? Similarly, when he heals the man with a shriveled hand, he pointed out their hypocrisy, observing that if their sheep fell into a well on the Sabbath, they would pull it out. They wouldn't wait till the next day and leave it in misery. And so he says, why should not I limit this man's suffering? Why should it be extended? And basically what he's suggesting in those two things is they have just messed up the stacking of moral obligation. Yes, there's many things that are important to do, but they actually exist in a proper stacked order. And the moral obligation to love is greater than this ritual observation of how you interpret the Sabbath. And he calls them out for the lack of compassion. When he eats grain on the Sabbath, this one's actually kind of an interesting one. When he eats grain on the Sabbath, and they come after him, he appeals to the fact that the Old Testament allowed and even required the temple priests to do work on the Sabbath. Even those that grew up with a framing that says like Sunday is the Sabbath and you shouldn't do any work on it. Well, what about Sloop and I? What about Barbara? Like, are we allowed to do work on the Sabbath, on Sunday? And the answer is not only are we allowed to, but we are required to. There are things that have to get done on Sunday, which isn't really the Sabbath, but, I hope the point stands, right? Jesus is points out to them that the temple priests do on the Sabbath things that for anybody else would be work. They were obliged, among other things, they were obliged to offer sacrifices. And one of the peculiar things that they had to do on the Sabbath was bake bread. He goes on to say that he himself is greater than the priests. He is greater than the temple, that he himself is Lord of the Sabbath. And if they could make bread out of grains on the Sabbath, well, then certainly he could roll up some grains and pop it in his mouth on the Sabbath, right? Because some things are allowed for some people to do on the Sabbath. Here in John 5, in the healing of the pool, he's going to offer a different argument. This is the one that's going to completely drive them out of their minds. Take a look at this, verse 16. And this is why the Jews were persecuting Jesus, because he was doing these things on the Sabbath. But Jesus answered them, my Father is working until now, and I am working. NIV is a little bit punchier, and I think it does a better job of capturing what it is that he's saying. Jesus says in the NIV, my Father is always at his work to this very day, and I too am working. Okay, this is a radical statement at least two different levels. First, because of what he's saying about the Father, and then second, because of what he is saying about himself. He says, listen, my Father works 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Do you really think that he has some answering service to respond to prayers on the weekends? He is at work constantly. Psalm 121 affirms this. It says, behold, he who keeps Israel will neither slumber nor sleep. The Lord is your keeper. The Lord is your shade on your right hand. The sun will not strike you by day, nor the moon by night. He works around the clock. The Lord will keep you from all evil. He will keep your life. Your Lord will keep your going out and your coming in from this time forth and forevermore. Jesus is saying, listen, you got this sense of this knocking off work, but the Father works around the clock attending to the needs of his people. And then, more distressingly to them, that probably piqued them, but this pushes them over the edge. Jesus includes himself in the elite divine community that is always at work. Colossians 1:17 says, in him all things hold together. What Jesus is saying is that he is my Father, and he works all the time. And as his son, I work all the time too. Jesus is the strong nuclear force. He is the thing that holds the world together. He supervises gravity, and there has not been a day or a second since he and the Father created time that the divine Son has not been sustaining creation. This is the claim that completely drove him crazy. Now, what I want you to see, I know this is a didactic, long teaching, so I hope you're still with me. What I want you to see is this. Jesus is going after this on purpose to draw the foul. Part of his mission, the center of his mission, was to come and live a perfect life of such obedience, such perfection, such holiness, that his very being, his greatness, his supremacy would exist as to be credited to us. And then, and this is kind of a tricky thing if you think about it, he had to be so holy, so perfect, so flawless, so utterly good to everyone that they would kill him. Right? It's a strange thing. How does he draw the foul? Well, he draws the foul by teaching things that are true, by saying things that are right, by loving people in inexplicably magnificent ways, but in a way that would run afoul of man-made religion. He shows up, and all the time he is just tweaking them and their sense of what things ought to be. What he does on purpose to aggravate them to killing him, while himself being perfectly holy and righteous. Now, this is why this matters. This is the climax of this whole thing. You may not ever hear this, all right? God instituted Sabbath keeping. That whole passage from Exodus 31, he meant every word of it. And we're not setting it aside. God meant this. This is incredibly important. He did so for a reason, but they misunderstood the reason. They got it backwards 180 degrees, and countless people have made the same error. You guys, God's purpose in instituting the Sabbath and being so insistent that it would be kept was that he was trying to train his people to know that life would not come merely through work, but paradoxically through rest. Now, let me be more explicit. Salvation would not come by work, but through resting in the finished work performed on their behalf. Sabbath existed for a reason, but the very thing that was meant to teach Israel that they should rest in God, that they should hope in God, that they should depend on God, that they should trust God to be their provider, had become for them a way to earn points. That day that had been designed to give them time to peel their eyes and their effort off of themselves and onto him had become a scorecard. They had flipped it upside down. Like everything else, you guys, everything in the Old Testament, the Sabbath points to Christ. For he is Lord of the Sabbath. He is the bringer of rest. And it is only when we trust in him to take away our sin and grant us his righteousness that we can finally, actually rest from our work. We don't have to strive. We don't have to earn. We don't have to perform. We simply receive his grace and live lives of love and obedience in response to his love. Jesus did not profane the Sabbath. He fulfilled the Sabbath. He is the Sabbath. He brings the Sabbath. He brings the rest, the real rest to which the Sabbath points. And according to Hebrews 4, the most urgent thing in life is to enter into that rest. God called the people, hey, once a week, knock off work. And it's really important that you do this in order to train them that they don't have to depend on their own self. I had a boss one time, Jeff Martin, and he said to me, Tim, the fact that you just want to work day in and day out is an evidence that you believe in a works righteousness rather than a grace righteousness. And that annoyed me. But I think it was true. The purpose of the rest is to point us to the real rest. And we don't earn points for resting. What we find is the heart of God that points us to his Son. Jesus intentionally, repeatedly, and flagrantly violated their misunderstanding of the Sabbath to destroy the edifice of man-made religion. He did so in a calculated way. It was a ploy to draw their ire so that they would kill him. And he did that so that he could purchase with his blood the deeper rest that we actually need, that we might abandon both our unrighteousness and our self-righteousness and rest in the finished work of Christ. So, my invitation to you, to me, is to stop trusting in performative rest and come to Christ for actual rest, for he and he alone provides it through his finished work of a righteous life and a death on a cross. Amen. Lord Jesus, again, it all comes to you. Everything comes to you. It's unbelievable the number of roads that end in you. And I pray here for those that have disregarded the teachings of the Sabbath, or that have trusted in their good boy, good girl points for doing something or not doing something on a Sunday or even a Saturday, that they would see that all of it was meant to be an object lesson, that each one here would be drawn to the real rest that the lesser rests point to, and that we would believe at a deep and abiding level that you have done all that is necessary, that your perfections are credited to us, and that our punishment has been absorbed by you, that we could stop striving and simply live lives of grateful, delighted, shocked, surprised obedience, because you are just so magnificent and great in all ways. Lord, we love you. Thank you for loving us. Amen.